This is Josh Cooperman with the Convo by Design podcast, and you're listening to US Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. We'll be producing shows weekly through the holidays, starting with George Smart in New York for the New York Architecture and Design Film Festival. On today's show, it's all about the national emergence of hip-hop architecture with Syracuse architecture professor Sekou Cooke. Support for U.S. Modernist Radio comes from Realtor Angela Roll. In a timeless adventure that we are largely making up, Angela supported her family from the age of 12 through black market carpentry and off-the-books house flipping. At 18, following an injury involving goat cheese, Jägermeister, Home Depot, and Charles Guathmy, Angela was recruited by her Uncle Marv, a design school operative working in Raleigh, North Carolina. Angela spent years imprisoned in nutrient and sleep-deprived architecture studios, tortured with balsa wood and styrofoam, rarely seeing the light of day.
How horrible.
She was dramatically rescued and taken to Sweden by international man of mystery Eric of Guttenberg, whom she later married, and while sketching on a napkin over meatballs at IKEA, they were confronted by the Architecture Review Board.
Ooh.
Angela narrowly escaped to North Carolina, via jetpack, of course, because all heroines have one, to become a formidable real estate agent with specialized design training, capable of brilliant advice to buyers and sellers of modernist houses. Angela Roll is your special agent. Reach her at angelaroll.com, that's ROEHL, or 919-995-0550. George?
Thank you, Tom. My week in New York was great. It was almost perfect weather. Cool, sunny, dry, calm, low winds, no rain. An easy time to wander around these great buildings with an emphasis on wandering. I'm still trying to learn the MTA bus and subway system. I got my MTA card so I can swipe it to go on different things, but it's going to take a while. One of the most unique places I wandered to is the museum, spelled with an extra M at both ends.
And is that how you say it?
I don't know, but it's spelled MMUSEUMM. And it's New York's smallest museum, clocking in at about 30 square feet. And that story is coming up later this month. It was truly exciting to talk with Sekou Cooke, a Jamaican-born architect with degrees from Cornell and Harvard. He is a published columnist, lecturer, and leader in advocating the expanded presence of minorities in architecture. If you think we live in a post-racial era in the profession of architecture, you'd be way wrong. Minorities in 1968 made up only about 1% of architects in America. And 50 years later, we're up to 2%. Not so good. Sekou and I spoke at the AIA New York Center for Architecture, where he has a major exhibition on through January 12th, called Close to the Edge, The Birth of Hip-Hop Architecture. Hip-hop is a cultural movement established by Black and Latino youth of New York's South Bronx in the early 70s. As your average, old, uptight guy from the South, I didn't know it was much more than just music, for example, or how influential the movement is in affecting music in the arts. The more I learned from talking with Sekou Cooke, the more excited I got about hip-hop's emergence as not just an influence on architecture, but something bursting to produce its own unique architecture.
Well, I want to start doing this backwards a little bit, okay? I've heard rumor that really good professors ask 3 questions when they're doing critiques.
Okay.
So before we tell people what hip-hop architecture is, I want to ask you, what works with hip-hop architecture? What doesn't work with hip-hop architecture? And what could be improved?
What can be improved? I usually phrase that as what can be done differently.
Okay.
But so it's not as subjective. So what works about hip-hop architecture is the name, the branding, the labeling of it, I think is really powerful because it starts out from this really provocative place of people immediately knowing or thinking that they know something about hip hop, or they understand what hip hop might be, and they know something about architecture. They understand what architecture might be, but they've never heard those two things spoken in the same breath. So
kind of like artificial sweetener.
Well, it conjures up some of these things that might make you think that it's a contradiction, it's a paradox.
Yeah.
But it's also just two realms that don't seem to fit together.
Okay.
So that in and of itself is a really powerful provocation. What doesn't work right now, I think, is partially connected to that it's not as deeply understood or as widely understood. So people think or believe that it's just a bit of a fad, a bit of a flash in the pan, something that is just kind of a gimmick that, just to get people's attention, without understanding that we're being really serious when we talk about hip-hop architecture as a thing, as a movement, as a way of thinking about the world and thinking about urbanity especially, and how these two worlds are really intimately connected. That I've once said in a lecture that we can't really have a contemporary conversation about urbanism without talking about hip-hop at all. And we can't really have a proper conversation about hip hop without talking about architecture, because architecture is at the very core of how hip hop came out. It came out of a very specific city, a very specific kind of urban environment, a very specific legacy, a very specific aesthetic. So those two things are so intimately connected in those two ways. What could be done differently? That's what I'm asking myself all day, every day, to move this project forward.
So these three questions are familiar to you because you use them a lot, right?
I do. I guess you read a piece that was written by one of my students a while back. Kudos on your research, by the way. So it's a thing I started when I started teaching at Syracuse in 2010. And I had taken it from some leadership training, some success training that I had done. I said, this should be used everywhere, or can be applied almost anywhere. And it's a way of separating the mostly subjective, mostly opinionated ways of talking about architecture, talking about work, and really separate the person from the work that they do, and not talk about, oh, I like this or I don't like this. It's like, what works about it? How does it really do the things that it's setting out to do? How does it not do the things that it's setting out to do? And you don't say, what can I change, or how can it be better? Because that's also subjective. It's like, how can we make it different? What's different that I could bring to it? What's my suggestion for improving it? And I think, especially with the kind of contentious nature of the architecture review, the architecture criticism, we want to always set up this dynamic that's not as adversarial, but really about helping students do better work and get to better results.
It's a more collaborative approach.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Yeah.
It's not, putting you in the great lofty faculty position, as God saying, you're good, you're not. Right?
Yeah, we know everything, and here are all the things that I've done and read, and here are the things that you don't understand. And really, that's the tradition that I grew up in, having gone to Cornell in the 90s. It was kind of an oppressive situation there. But I really want to open it up to more of a dialogue and, as you say, a collaborative approach, so that professors really feel like they're collaborators with the students in getting these projects forward. We have a lot more experience, a lot more perspective on different precedents or different ways of working, and we can advise them and coach them and guide them in different ways, but we can't really, one, do it for them, or two, we can't expect them to know all these things on the other side. So it is interesting, because I was telling you just before that just this past week, I drove down from Cambridge because I was at a meeting of the Harvard GSD Alumni Council.
Sure.
And one of the big things that came out of that meeting is that students there are still having trouble with just basic civility between students and professors, that they're finding it to be a really torturous, traumatic space to be in, and not a space of learning, and not a space of these high aspirations that are supposed to be part of the Harvard GSD experience. So that was really quite troubling for most of us to hear. And we're working on many, many ways of working through that and making that more powerful.
Our listeners know that our research staff, Cindy Stratton, not her real name, usually really digs deep about our guests, but she was not available for this one.
Okay.
So I had to do it by myself.
Okay.
And I've had a great time. I've learned a lot that I want to talk about.
Sure.
Being your just sort of average, very uninformed person out there in the world about hip-hop architecture. But you started out in Jamaica, right?
I did.
You're the only Jamaican architect I think I've ever met.
Really?
How do you find role models in Jamaica for design?
Yeah, there are quite a few of us. Most I think most that I know are of my generation or younger. The people that I looked up to or had connection with, at least when I was growing up in Jamaica, were all from this one firm called Harold Morris and Associates, and a gentleman named Robert Woodstock. He's AIA. I don't know if he's FAIA, but he's done most of his practice and his work in Jamaica. And he also did his undergraduate studies at Cornell. And I remember he interviewed me for my entrance into Cornell. So, which was amazing, just to find somebody to do a live interview, and I didn't have to fly all the way to Ithaca to do that. So those are the people who I saw, and they were the only firm really doing any real progressive work at the time, when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. But inspiration for architecture is everywhere. I've really grown to find inspiration in all kinds of places, in nature, in really informal ways of building, informal construction techniques. One of my, after I get past some of this hip-hop architecture stuff and do it to a level that I feel like it's done, it's time to move on to another subject, I really want to spend some time understanding some of the indigenous and African-based and culturally specific construction techniques that exist that are contemporary and traditional. But you can find architecture almost anywhere. I didn't realize it growing up that was the case, but I had a lot of influence that way. The person I owe, I think, the most debt to, in terms of getting me from where I was as a kid in Jamaica to becoming an architect right now is my sister. Okay. Yeah, my sister Nina Cooke John, who's also an architect.
Oh, okay. Yeah, older or younger?
Older. She's 5 years older than I am.
Okay.
The old story is that I knew I wanted to be an architect since I was 5 years old. I had no idea what that was, and she, being 5 years older than I am, should have known way before me, but she didn't decide till she was about 15 or 16. So she, being the pioneer that she is, she came to the States and she did a couple years at City College in New York before then transferring to Cornell, doing 4 more years at Cornell before getting her BArch there. And just before her last year, she literally filled out my application for me. She took pictures of all my work and helped me put my portfolio together, set up the interviews, talked to the administration, made sure that I got in. And I still had another year of high school left.
Wow.
I didn't even know what was going on. All of a sudden I got this acceptance that I was like, oh, I guess I'm going to Cornell.
That is a great early admission story.
Yeah. A whole year early. Yeah.
Did you have a hard time adjusting to Ithaca's climate?
Hard time? No, I adjusted. I think I was young enough to be very nimble and adaptive, so I made it work.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you went to Harvard?
I didn't go. It took me a while to get to Harvard. I spent 5 years at Cornell and then immediately came to New York City, and I worked here. I lived in Brooklyn, worked in Manhattan for about 6 years.
Okay.
I did, right after getting my license, I was here for another year and did my first kind of failed attempt at a private practice where I collaborated with a few other colleagues, one of whom is in the show, Olalekan Jafus, whose work is all over the place here in the show, really amazing work, and Efrain Perez and Anale Owanen, and the four of us had a little practice that we did a couple of things here in the city. And then after 7 years in New York, I left and went to San Francisco. And then I kind of had to start from scratch again, look for another job. But that was the first time I really started teaching more comprehensively. So I taught at CCA in San Francisco, taught architecture studios and representation classes there. I was there for 4 years before the economy tanked at the end of 2009. I had no work. I had no projects. I'd started in 2008. I rebooted my practice and started from scratch again. I had a few projects at the beginning of 2008. By the end of 2008, there was no work there. And around that time, just at the end of 2009, I got a call from someone at Syracuse saying, "Hey, there's a position here we'd like you to apply for." Like, I didn't think I'd ever go back to central New York after the winters in Ithaca. But I said, not much is happening here for me in San Francisco anymore, so might as well do that. So I applied for that job, did not get that job, got a different job, and I was there for 2 years in Syracuse before realizing that if I wanted to advance in my academic career, I really needed a master's degree.
Yeah.
So at that point, then I decided to go back to school and applied to Harvard and got in, and that's how I got back here. So it was a 13-year span between undergrad and grad, and I'd done virtually everything in that time span. I'd taught, I'd had my own practice, I was licensed. The only thing I hadn't done is got a master's degree. So I spent a year and a half doing an MArch II program in architecture at Harvard, and before going right back to Syracuse to teach again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, did your area of research focus in hip-hop architecture develop at Harvard, or was it?
That's exactly where it started. I often joke that I went to grad school to learn how to read and write. That's where everything really changed for me. And it's hard to describe because I was there for such a short period of time. But after that period, everything changed. The way that I read changed. The way that I write changed.
How did it change?
So the things that I became interested in was very different. I definitely started... I didn't read a whole lot before, and I started reading much more expansively into some of the kind of basic architecture texts and grounding myself into more theory and history. I remember in undergrad history classes when I started to sleep, right?
Yeah, sure.
The slides go on, the lights get dimmed, and you hadn't slept for a few nights because you're working on your studio project, so you just fall asleep. So just immersing myself in a little bit more history was really quite eye-opening. It also changed the way that I practice and the way that I teach. So everything about my architecture career changed just by being in that environment. The writing was the most interesting part because I had written a little bit here and there, done some really early blog posts on my website, and I was a pretty decent writer in high school.
Yeah,
I remember just creative writing. I did a creative writing course in undergrad as well, but it wasn't until I took a class with Sanford Quinter. I don't know if you've met Sanford. No. He's now at Pratt. He teaches theory classes. And he writes about architecture. He's not an architect himself, but he writes a lot about architecture and teaches architecture theory. But he taught this class. It was the first time he taught this class that was about writing about architecture. And he wanted a very select group of people that were really committed not just to writing as an academic exercise or as a class exercise, but writing for publication. And saying that in this class, we're going to do some real writing, we're going to read a lot of real writing, and we're going to publish generate things that we're going to really publish. And it was really eye-opening. Actually, the most eye-opening moment, the first moment that really opened my eyes was when, in the first class, when he described the kind of agony that writers go through in the process of getting from not having anything to a fully fleshed out piece.
Yeah.
And like, oh my God, I thought it was just me.
It's everybody.
It's everybody. And until that point, I didn't realize that I am a writer, because I thought before that I'm definitely not a writer, because this is such a hard process to me. But I didn't realize that every writer goes through that. And that triggered something in me. And I was able to then really invest myself in this project of writing. And one of the first topics that came up was Kanye West. Mm-hmm. And who
you had invited to Harvard, right?
Yeah. So that was the actual writing project.
Okay.
The writing project was writing to Kanye West in an invitation.
Is this like a Dear Santa letter, but just more advanced?
Yes, it was Dear Kanye. It was a Dear Kanye letter, exactly. And, because it came up from, he had done some interviews, and there's a very famous interview that he did early on with Zane Lowe, this British DJ.
Okay.
And where he was talking about, I'm meeting with 5 architects at a time. Yeah, I'm inspired by architecture. I love architects. And, I'm always working, when I'm talking to my architect over there and I'm talking to my architect over there. And we were all blown away. How is he talking about architecture so much? We had no idea he had any interest in architecture at all. And the crazy thing is that the response from the architecture community was, how dare Kanye say anything about architecture? He's so uninformed. Yeah. He doesn't know anything. It's so out of his league.
Yeah.
Right? He should just leave this topic alone before he does something worth noting, right?
If you're not in the priesthood, don't be screwing around with the Bible.
Exactly. But I was struck by that as a really elitist point of view. And it's so typical of architecture to be really insular, trying to protect this thing that is seen as so precious, where from my point of view, it's severely undervalued by our own doing. And it's not as precious as we make it seem. And I think it needed some shaking up. It needed to be broken down quite a bit. So
it was a big deal at the time. I mean, it just
absolutely.
Picked up by all these news organizations, and not just in architecture, but, you pick it up and read it in mainstream magazines.
Yeah. It was quite an event. It's such an event that it got spun out of control really quickly. And
that seems to be the case whenever Kanye does something these days.
It was a whole lot more hype than substance. So the group of us who were really responsible for it wanted to make sure that the record was set straight, that this wasn't just Kanye doing a celebrity stunt thing.
This was a genuine interest.
It's a genuine interest, and that we wanted to engage him in a very specific way. So to tell the full story, right after that interview got published online, it made the rounds through our GSD African American Student Union email chain, and we were just talking about it. And then somebody put out a joke saying, we should have Kanye be on our reviews. And then I responded and said, really? We probably could.
Yeah.
Why not invite him? Who are our networks? Who do we know who knows him? We all know people. We should try to see if we can get a letter in his hand to do this. And then a group of us decided, this is a really good idea. And the African American Student Union was very proactive in setting a meeting and saying, okay, this is what we're going to do. And then I said, here I am. I'm in this writing class. This is something that will be a perfect opportunity for us to write about. And the kind of backstory, dirty secret story, is that I wanted the letter to be public. I wanted it to be an open letter, because I thought there's no way Kanye's actually going to come.
Right.
He's not actually going to engage us in that way. But he'll engage us in the public realm, right? And I was wrong. He was definitely willing to engage us in private. So I was overruled, and they decided to make it a private letter. And no one, that has never been made public. It's all very private still. And so myself and a colleague, Sarah Zude, worked on the letter together, and we sent it, and he got it in his hands. And little did we know till after over a month later that he said yes almost immediately.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And only one person in our group knew, and he held that information to his chest for a month.
Wow.
Didn't tell anybody until it was a couple days before, and said, okay, yes, he's going to come. And he's going to come in through the back door of the GSD, and we're going to have a very
Was this by request of
meeting.
Kanye to not let the word get out?
I believe so. I could say yes or no, but that would be rehistoricizing it.
Yeah.
But he came, it was like a Sunday evening. I remember it was raining outside. He drove up in the back. His entourage came in first, and we're in this little room, about 12 of us.
How large is a Kanye entourage?
It was only about 4 people.
Okay.
It was, Virgil Abloh, who's very famous now for his Off-White brand. A couple other people who I didn't recognize before that, and Kim.
Okay.
Kim Kardashian.
So she came too?
Yeah, she was there. And
oh, wow.
Yeah, it was funny because before she actually came in, we were just joking to ourselves, wouldn't it be funny if Kim Kardashian walks through that door? And then she did.
This was 2013, right?
This was 2013,
okay.
yeah. October 17, 2013, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And it was a very small meeting. Again, just a few of us in that room. We historically documented it with a photograph where we gave photo credit to Kim Kardashian, which I thought was the funniest
cool,
thing.
Yeah.
But he spoke to us for over an hour. It's like an hour and a half in that room, really engaging with us about all the different work.
Did he do the critiques too?
No, he never did. He never did that part. No.
Okay, just checking.
No. The letter was open-ended. It was say, we just want to engage with you. We just want you to come here, talk with us. We know you're interested in architecture. We're interested in what you can bring to architecture. We're interested in this dialogue. We wanted to start a dialogue that would continue further. And it was really eye-opening to hear how intelligent he is on the subject of design and architecture, and how involved he has been, and how his group Donda has been invested in design for such a long time. And he hires people who came out of architecture school to work in his creative practice. So none of this the public knew about very much. I mean, a few people knew, but not very widely.
Right.
So it was a really powerful, fascinating meeting. And then after the meeting, then he walks around the entire GSD through the trays, and we show him the studios, we show him the shops. But then, of course, as he's walking through the trays, people are working on a late Sunday night, and they see Kanye West and Kim Kardashian suddenly walk by their desk, and they're like, "What's going on?" And then by the time he gets to the bottom, there's a whole slew of people following behind him.
They're pouring out of the doorways.
Yeah, exactly. Again, it's Sunday night, but typically in an architecture studio, there's a lot of people still there on a Sunday night.
Yeah.
At that moment, he felt inspired. He said, I got to say something. I got to organize something. Can we get them all to our show? And his main goal was to announce to everybody, the whole audience there, that he wanted them all to come to his concert later that night.
Okay.
So he jumped up on a desk, started talking, and only about 2.5 minutes of that has been captured. He spoke for about 5 minutes. So the last 2.5 minutes were captured, or maybe it's the middle 2.5 minutes.
Someone's going, "Where's my phone? Where's my phone?"
Exactly. And then that got kind of recategorized as that was the event, that he came there to speak to the Harvard students but it was just a moment of inspiration. It just happened in a split second. And then all of a sudden everybody said, "Oh, I guess I'm going to this concert tonight."
It was.
He let 315 people in to the concert for free.
Wow.
Yeah, at the Boston, at the TD Garden. It was amazing concert. Yeah.
Well, we've been keeping the audience in suspense long enough. So now that we've chatted all around it, let's talk about what hip-hop architecture is.
What it is.
One of the things that I was fascinated to learn about was the impact of Robert Moses and the Bronx Expressway and all of that. So tell us a story about the origins of hip-hop and then how we're kind of fusing into design.
Sure. I think we have to start by understanding that what hip-hop is. I think in most people's consciousness is it's just a genre of music.
It's just music, but it's four major areas,
At least four.
With a possible five?
Possible five.
Okay.
We'll talk about that in a second. But so, hip-hop is a cultural movement that started in a very specific way. And it has a broad reach. As we all know, it's global reach.
Yeah.
And it's pervasive in all marginalized neighborhoods, marginalized people especially. And on the other side, it's been highly capitalized. So it touches so many different points at the same time. But historically, there's some really important dates. There's some really important points in history. One of the first important ones is 1959. That's when the construction for the Cross Bronx Expressway began.
Which is 95, right?
Yes, I-95 cuts right through. So it cut right through what was at the time a historically Jewish neighborhood, a poor Jewish neighborhood. They all got displaced. The Cross Bronx gets cut right through. Everybody who lived around there started to move out. Property values went way down. And the only people who could afford to live there were the African Americans and the Caribbean immigrants. So they all heavily populated the South Bronx around the Cross Bronx Expressway. And none of the older property owners were willing to be invested in the area anymore. So they all heavily divested. Then the slumlords moved in, and along with the slumlords, then you had people burning buildings down for insurance purposes you have this area now that's really bombed out.
I remember a lot of 70s movies were about the Bronx.
Yeah, there was one of the most famous ones. It's called about Fort Apache.
Yeah,
and characterized the people of the Bronx as like the worst of the worst, just complete degenerates. And that was happening all around the same time. And this is the environment out of which hip-hop arose, right? So it's the poorest of the poor, really lowest valued housing possible. When low-income housing got built, it was in these really bland modernist blocks that were the cheapest of the cheap. And then all the public services were being stripped away from the system. So you didn't have any art programs, no music programs, no after-school programs, no libraries. So
it's because the government didn't provide the funding to maintain the things, only to build them. Exactly.
And that's the historically Pruitt-Igoe example, whereas it was more of a maintenance thing than a construction thing, right? And that great documentary about Pruitt-Igoe talks about how the people there actually liked it. They actually were invested in being there, but it was so underfunded and undermaintained.
And one thing too, they came up with a lot of this happened all over the country. Mm-hmm. They come up with bogus reasons not to put important services.
Exactly.
Like you couldn't have a grocery store in the development because it would compete with another grocery somewhere else.
Exactly. Yeah, it's all insane. So you can understand why all of these things kind of developed around that time. So another really important date, which is kind of a mythical date in the history of hip hop, is August 15, 1973, when DJ Kool Herc had his famous party in the Rec Room at 1520 Cedric Avenue.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and this
is the ground zero point here?
That's the mythical birthplace of hip-hop.
Okay.
But if, real hip-hop historians understand that there's a whole lot of history that happened before that, and, even the musical styles and the dance styles and the graffiti, there's a lot that was happening way before that, but it was kind of the first marked time where all these things kind of came together in that one party. And that location is still kind of heralded as a really important location and heavily visited still, even though it's still just like a public housing project or a low-income housing project. But that date is important because that's when a few other things started around. So Kool Herc and African Bambaataa, and then later Grandmaster Flash were all hosting parties in different areas of the Bronx. And it was now a new scene that people were looking for. And it became this new channel for all of the creative energies of all these kids. Again, they were just high school kids. You know?
Sure.
Herc was maybe 15 or 16 when he hosted this party. And Bambaataa was around the same age. And it was just a youth culture. And they were having parties in public parks or in high school gyms or in rec rooms like that first mythical party. And they were finding ways of expressing themselves in music, in dance, in art. It was just an amazing new thing. The other two important dates are one, 1975, I believe it's October 15 again. October 25, I think, 1975, the famous Ford to City Drop Dead headline in the Daily News. It was just this marker that the city had divested so much public services for the city, right? And that kind of marks the tenor of what the area was like and what it was like to live in New York City at that time, especially in that area. Other areas where the hip hop culture was just starting to flourish, like in some areas in Brooklyn and in Queens and in Harlem, usually around these densely clustered low-income houses, where the poorest residents lived. But an even more important date was in the summer of 1977 with the big blackout.
Oh, right. Sure. Yeah. I remember that.
77. Yeah. So the blackout of 77 is historically seen as one of the major catalysts to hip hop, because before that you had maybe 4 sound systems. People who had put together their sound systems, putting these records together, build these massive speakers, and that's where the parties were. But equipment was expensive, so you had to throw a party to get money to buy more equipment. After the blackout, now there's riots, there's break-ins, there's looting, and then people just went to the equipment stores, to the radio stores, and took all the equipment they needed. The rest of that summer, they had more hip hop parties across the city than any other time.
Well, that's certainly one way to expand the field.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely did a lot for it. There's a lot of great writings about that and histories on that. But
unless you're the equipment store owner, it's not such a good story.
Such a good story, but it's probably one of the most positive things that came out of that era. So yeah, so that's as deep as I go into hip hop history and just understanding, the 4 elements of hip hop.
Tell us about the 4 elements,
Sure.
Because I learned a lot about that. I thought it was just like the DJ part.
Yeah.
But
yeah, so the 4 elements, DJing, MCing, b-boying, and graffiti. And then later on, there are other elements that have been added on. KRS.
Should we just call the 5th element Kanye and leave it at that?
Kanye is the 5th element. No, so KRS-One is probably one of the most important hip hop historians and educators. He educates through hip hop and about hip hop. And he talks about the 5th element being knowledge, knowledge of where you're from, knowledge of where you're going, knowledge of the people, knowledge of yourself. And then there are other elements. I can't name them in order, but there's, like literature and fashion and so forth. I think part of what I'm making a case for is for architecture to be another element. I was hoping it could be the 5th element, but it can't really replace knowledge. I think knowledge is a little bit more important than architecture.
More encompassing, yeah.
But those all, early on, they kind of worked in tandem with each other. They were all heavily related to each other. And the earliest pioneers of hip hop, they were doing multiple things. So, people would be DJs and they were breakdancers at the same time, or people would be MCs and they would be graffiti artists. It was just like you're part of the culture. You do 1 or 2 things, but you're not necessarily trying to make a whole career out of doing one thing. You're just you're just participating. You're just in the hip hop scene.
So how did this connect to that fateful day when somebody said, I'm going to renovate a room, or I'm going to add on to this building, or in that sense? How did it start connecting to structural architecture?
I think that's something that I'm still in a search for. I would love to tell a narrative, a story about how this hip hop culture made a conscious decision to create its own environments, and that they were going to add architecture in and practice architecture in one way or another. It's not a story that I can tell right now. It's something that I'm piecing together and starting to construct.
Well, let me ask you this.
Sure.
In another universe.
Sure.
Is Wakanda hip-hop architecture from Black Panther?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a part in my show here where downstairs called the B-sides, where I talk about different architectural movements or theoretical movements that are tangential to hip-hop architecture, but they weren't specifically about hip-hop. So it's hard to include them in the main show, the main body of the show. But Afrofuturism is one of those main areas. And Afrofuturism is very similar to hip hop because it's creating an image of what an architecture might be by sampling different imagery and different kinds of because
I was blown away by the design of Wakanda in that movie.
I think it was fantastic, and the production designer did an amazing job. It's funny, halfway through or partway through the opening and people finding out about the film and seeing it, people were going back to Lacan Jafus and saying, "This is your work, right?" Like, I didn't know you had work in the movie, but he's an architect, visual designer that does these really amazing Afrofuturist scenes. But it was completely disconnected from him. But we're completely convinced that the production designer saw his work
inspired
and were inspired. Absolutely. And so they were constructing a history that didn't really exist, right? So they're constructing and pulling together pieces of aesthetics that never really came together before. So if you think about people who are in poor African Americans and Caribbean Americans here in New York, they don't have a historical reference to go to either. So they are kind of piecing together their own culture, their own identity. The image of what hip hop is really kind of an Afrofuturist project. So hip hop architecture is something that is thinking about how do we construct identities, or what kind of identities were constructed around that time and how they relate to the built environment. What kind of environments were they creating? So when a DJ puts on a party, they're appropriating a space because they're using a space that was never meant for a party. They're throwing together records and a mixer in a way that were never meant to be put together. And they're stealing electricity from a power grid that was never meant to be done in that way. So they're constructing this environment in a very intentional way that is directly related to architecture. But it's so temporary and so performative that it's not something that is easily included in the realm of architecture.
Because it just exists in a moment, right?
It exists in a moment. It disappears.
So I know this is all new and emerging.
Sure. Yes.
But are there examples of hip-hop architecture now that people can drive by and see in the world?
That's, again, a tough question. It should be an easier question. And I think this falls under the heading of what doesn't work so well about hip-hop architecture, because people are looking for a very specific example, a very specific style. And you can't see, I'm making air quotes right now.
Yeah.
A very specific style that comes out of it and an image of what it looks like and want to point a finger at it. But the truth is, hip-hop architecture is much more about creating a process, creating an identity, creating a narrative of how a project is created that is seeking to understand the core phenomenon of what makes something hip hop. What is the attitude behind the thing? What is the spirit behind the thing? does it embody and embrace all of the same kind of values, the same kind of visual and sonic and emotional aesthetics of a space? You know, if you walk into a space, and I'm hoping that when people walk into this space, they feel like, oh, yeah, there's something hip-hop about this space, right? I understand how it connects back to hip-hop. And so some of the processes have to do with sampling, of course, like sampling heavily, mixing, remixing, cutting up things. Layering is very important. Embracing various aspects of time and temporality. So things that some parts are naturally going to wear and change over time. Some parts are naturally interactive, and some parts are much more permanent. And so if we understand architecture as more of a four-dimensional pursuit, then you'd understand the kinds of hip-hop spaces that can exist.
Have there been any buildings that have gotten close?
Yeah.
Like that sort of are on the way there?
Absolutely. I think there are buildings that I've included in the show, kind of controversially, some work that's from Australia, in Melbourne, Australia, that when 5 years ago, if you Googled hip-hop architecture, you would have seen exactly that project pop up.
Okay.
Because
this is the one with the giant graffiti sort of out in front of it?
The giant graffiti, the three-dimensionally extruded graffiti.
Yeah.
It's called Hive on the side. And that catches people's attention. It's like, oh, it's graffiti. It's three-dimensional.
You should be Googling this now, folks. Type it in now. The Hive, Melbourne, Australia.
Yeah. And that is problematic in many ways because, first of all, it's kind of a static representation of one of the four elements of hip hop. Take something like graffiti that is very temporal, always changing, always layered, and making it kind of a static architectural thing. And Goethe aside, with his frozen music, we don't really want to freeze graffiti and make it into a building, right? So there are other elements of that building that are actually a lot more interesting. It's actually kind of a good building, separate from its hip-hop context. It's like a really nice building. There are certain parts of it that, to me, are much more hip-hop in terms of not just the arrows that make the window that also harken back to graffiti, but the main living room on the ceiling has a fish tank on the ceiling.
Oh, nice.
To me, that's the most hip-hop thing about the whole project, because it's about attitude, it's about bling, it's about saying that it's a really bold, brash statement that, hey, I can do this. But
it seems like something you're talking about would be a great something for the Serpentine Pavilion in London. One of those things that comes up for 2 or 3 months and then disappears.
I think a hip-hop architecture Serpentine Pavilion would be amazing.
Oh, fabulous.
If you know anybody, you can hook me up. I'll be happy to do it.
Listeners, if you have any connections to London,
to the AA,
you know where to write in about.
I did have one other part to add about the buildings that look like hip-hop, because I think this is where the B-sides in the show becomes much more important.
Okay.
Is where it's talking about these other architectural movements that actually do look like hip-hop architecture in a certain way. Deconstructivism has long been thought of as a kind of method that is about breaking down and flipping the script and mixing and mashing different things together. And someone once said that hip-hop was decon before decon was decon, right?
Right.
So
more jazz.
Yeah,
oriented.
exactly. So hip-hop is kind of a deconstructivist project in and of itself. So having deconstructivism become a real architectural movement is pretty important to the topic. Then there are other things like informal settlements, like favelas, like how they kind of are constantly changing and constantly evolving. And
because this is not limited to the black community. This is the Latino community as well.
Absolutely. It's really any marginalized community, right? And then there are other parts in there like activist architecture that's really up in your face and upfront about what its political motivations are. And then the last piece, we talk about Afrofuturism, and the last piece is what I call Neopostmodernism, where they are actually embracing the postmodernist ideology of referencing different things outside of itself and bringing that playfulness into the design process. But they actually use terms in their designs such as remixing and sampling and mashups. And these are all hip-hop projects.
Kanye bringing in Herzog and de Meuron into his lyrics.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that was kind of he's just kind of name dropping for name dropping's sake.
Right.
But it's for
still, it's
people
different.
Get it.
Yeah.
Like, if you get it, you get it, right? And that's always been part of hip-hop as well. I thought that was really important to talk about, especially in talking about when people are trying to find what does hip-hop architecture look like? Where can I find a hip-hop architecture building? And really throughout the show, you'll notice that most of these projects are aspirational projects. They're theoretical projects. They're student projects. They're loose projects that academics have been working on. So it's beginning to come. It's an idea, a theory that has arrived that we can point to, but it's not an aesthetic style as yet. And I think once it becomes an aesthetic style, then it's actually going to cease to be hip hop. I think it's going to be a sad day. As a matter of fact, people have talked about or commented that this show itself might be the first nail in the coffin of hip hop architecture.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Because once you name it and once you allow everybody else to understand what it is, then it can no longer be connected.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I think you got something here. I think this thing has legs.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you. I hope so.
This thing definitely has legs. So you got slavery for 400 years.
Yes.
You got marginalization for another 100 years.
Yes.
You got a sort of half-hearted Civil Rights Act. Mm-hmm. And then you have imprisonment.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So what happens when architects get approached to do things like prisons?
Yeah.
Should they start like turning these down, or I mean, how do you deal with the social justice issues inside the architecture profession?
Yeah.
Because the individual architects I talk to they're all so cool, and they're very progressive, and they all have the right opinions. Now I'm using air quotes around right, but you get a group of architects together, and that's a lot tougher.
Yeah.
They act like the Republican Party over doing that,
especially the AIA, right?
So how do you start getting people to wake up in architecture about any level of responsibility in that?
I think it's bringing awareness to the people that are affected. Recognizing that architecture is inherently a humanistic profession, humanistic discipline, right? It sometimes gets included within the humanities, as it should, I believe. And I always think it's funny when the most controversial statement I make is that architecture is about people, but that's not what we're taught. No. Historically, we're not taught that architecture is about people. We're taught that it's about ideas. It's about really higher things than people could even understand. It's about form. It's about space. It's about light. But ultimately, it should be how all those things affect people, right? How does form affect people? How does space affect people? How does light affect people? And if you strip those things away from people, how do they react? How do they respond? We all know from all of the sociological experiments that we are partially, at least, products of our environment.
Right.
And as architects, we are the primary shapers of environment. So we should care about how those environments affect people. So if you're going to design a prison, are you going to design the nicest prison that's going to make sure everybody in that environment feels good and comes out all rehabilitated?
Right?
No.
Or are you going to design the Jeremy Bentham Panopticon?
Yeah.
Supermax.
And the Panopticon is what the client wants. They want to make sure that people get downtrodden, that they get controlled, that they are organized. And it's no news to you, I'm sure, to most people that right after slavery was the expansion of the prison industrial complex. So you just basically take the same people that used to be slaves and now you move them into the prison system and you get them to keep working
right
in the same way, like the prison chain gangs, right?
Well, in the process of researching for the show, I stumbled across a video game. Have you seen this? Called Prison Architect.
no.
It's an actual video game.
Wow.
And you build your prison, and you also build the programming in the prison. So you can build cells that are humane. You can have...
Who's behind this?
I don't know, but I saw the reviews of it. You can buy modules for it. You can have this. And if you build this... Say you're building a rehabilitation type prison, like one you might find in Norway or Sweden. Then what the game starts to do is have people complain about your rehabilitation program. Like mayors will call you up and want to cut your funding.
Exactly. Which is real world, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So how do you win? How do you win that game? Right?
I don't know how you win. I know that the review I was going to say he tried the very severe prison and he tried the very lenient prison, and neither of them worked out so well for him in the game. It was an extremely hard challenge to do.
I think you win when you just demolish all the prisons.
Okay.
Just get rid of them. And this is where I get the most political, is when I start to think about the potential advocacy that architects can have or engage in. That we should have a seat at all these tables as an organization, or we should have an organization that actually advocates for us in this way, that makes sure that we don't take these commissions on. Like if architects in general all across the country decided that we're just not going to do any, who's going to designs the prisons?
Well,
right?
Does NOMA, the National Organization of Minority Architects, step into this pool at all, or no?
I think they could and should. I think they've been doing a lot of thinking around social justice for sure. And there's some very amazing active members of NOMA who have been at the forefront of the social justice scene and doing some amazing work around there. And I know within the conferences at NOMA, they give space for that and invite some really amazing people to talk through those issues. I don't know if I have too many powerful things to say about NOMA as an organization that advocates politically for those kinds of spaces.
Okay.
Or the AIA for that matter.
Okay. You personally, I hear, it's another rumor, are designing a house in my state, North Carolina, in Wilmington?
I did already.
You did already?
Yeah.
Is it done?
It's done. It survived the hurricane.
Excellent.
Yes. And it's not photographed as yet. Okay. Which is a combination of a couple things. One, just finding the time that works best between me and the clients, because you don't want to inconvenience them, because photo shoots take a whole day and you want to make sure it works.
Tell us how this house looks. And
that goes to point number 2, why it's not photographed, that it's not my proudest work. It's like, not that I think I did a job or anything. It's just that I feel you have a very specific vision for exactly what something does or what something wants to be. And you separate yourself a little bit from when you're separated by distance. And, if I were Herzog and Demeron or Rem Koolhaas, I'll be flying constantly back and forth to do all that. And
you haven't put the down payment on the jet yet, have you?
No, yeah. So I don't have the bandwidth to do all of that. So, certain things get slipped between the cracks, and then the contractor takes over, imposes his will. It's like, well, these are the houses that I typically build, but I'm really underselling the house. I think the clients have said that people pass by and love the house. They stop in and want to see it. They love the house themselves.
Is it a modern style house or more
it's a progressive,
like Southern?
Yeah, it's a progressive style house. It's kind of a long bar. In the center is a double height space with the kitchen and living room that opens out to a screen porch, or it's screened in so it opens out to a back porch, and it's a front porch, back porch. One wing is the master bedroom, the garage, and what they call the frog, the family room over the garage, and the other side is the other 3 bedrooms and bathrooms, and then there's a kind of office loft that looks over the double height space. And the stairway is one of the most fun pieces of it, the stair kind of pokes out into the front of the house.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and we had some fun with using standing seam metal on the roof that is pretty distinct. The siding is kind of nice. I originally wanted that standing seam metal roof to fold down onto the face of the building.
Sure.
I think that was just too much.
Was that beyond the capability of the contractor?
The client, I don't think it was the capability. He just couldn't wrap his mind around it. And actually, when they originally bid the project, that's what the design called for, and the clients were all for it. And then you know how contractors can be. They can convince a client that this is how things are done, right, and you had to do it the right way. So I kind of took a back seat and made sure that it happened to a way that they were all happy. My primary goal was to make them happy. I didn't want to put too heavy a stamp on it and impose my will. I really wanted to create a good space for them to live their lives, right?
Right. Well, please let me know when you get some photos, and please come back to North Carolina and make more houses, because we love new houses by architects in our area, and we're really trying to grow on the tradition. Our state is the third largest.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I have family in Raleigh and Durham, and I've visited there quite a bit in the last couple of years, so I'm more than happy to come down.
Well, thanks so much for joining me today. It's been great.
Thank you so much, George, for having me.
Thanks for listening. US Modernist Radio is underwritten by Angela Roll, your special agent for Modernist Houses, 919-995-0550. Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to our past shows and access 2.2 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. US Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Researcher Cindy Stratton, that's quotes around that because it's not a real name, is part of the Witness Protection Program, and she reports in from an anonymous email. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Triangle Modernist Archive, a nonprofit education organization for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guile. George and I will see you next week with another DJ'd, MC'd, B-boyed, graph artist edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.